The first thing I heard wasn't the screaming. It was the silence that came right before it, that strange kind of silence you only get when a couple hundred people all notice the same thing at once. Then a second later the panic hit. People started running. Somebody dropped a champagne glass. Kids were crying. Women in expensive summer dresses were climbing over pool chairs trying to get away from water that absolutely wasn't supposed to be bubbling like that. And from the front porch of my little cabin nearly half a mile away, I just leaned against the railing with my coffee and watched the whole mess unfold because, believe it or not, none of that would have happened if they hadn't spent the last 2 years treating my property like their own private sewer. My name's Cole Mercer, and for almost 15 years I'd lived on 16 quiet acres tucked into the rolling hills outside Ash Creek, the kind of place where mornings started with deer walking through the meadow, evenings ended with frogs singing along the creek, and your closest neighbors were usually hawks circling overhead instead of people complaining about fence colors. I bought that land because I wanted peace, not because I hated people, just because I'd spent enough years working construction to know the world gets loud enough without inviting more noise into your backyard. Then everything changed when a developer showed up with glossy brochures and promises about luxury country living. They carved up the old farmland surrounding me and built something they called Cedar Ridge Preserve, 36 oversized homes wrapped around an artificial lake with walking trails, a fancy clubhouse, tennis courts, and a resort-style swimming pool that looked like something you'd expect behind a 5-star hotel instead of in the middle of former cattle country. Every weekend sounded like a music festival. Golf carts buzzed around until midnight. Fireworks exploded for birthdays I'd never been invited to. And while I wasn't thrilled about losing my quiet little corner of the county, I figured that was simply the price of progress. They stayed on their side. I stayed on mine. Everybody moved on with life. Or at least that's what I believed. About 2 summers after the subdivision opened, I noticed something odd. On especially hot afternoons, my creek carried a faint smell, nothing overwhelming, just enough to make me wrinkle my nose. I blamed it on algae at first, then maybe a dead raccoon somewhere upstream, because nature has never exactly smelled like fresh laundry. But every week the odor got stronger, the water slowly changed from clear to cloudy, and fish I'd watched for years suddenly disappeared. Even the deer stopped drinking from the creek. And if you've lived around wildlife long enough, you learn to pay attention whenever animals decide something isn't safe. One Saturday morning I grabbed my boots and followed the creek upstream, figuring I'd eventually find whatever had died. Instead, I found something far worse. Hidden beneath fresh dirt and patches of decorative grass was a large plastic utility pipe crossing directly through my property before disappearing back toward Cedar Ridge Preserve. I kept following it, and every 100 yards my stomach sank a little lower. Whoever installed that line had gone out of their way to hide it, weaving it through the trees where nobody driving by would ever notice. When I finally reached the edge of the subdivision, the truth was sitting right in front of me. That pipe connected directly to Cedar Ridge's wastewater system. Their entire neighborhood had been quietly sending sewage across my land instead of using the treatment infrastructure they were supposed to build. My creek wasn't naturally polluted. It had been turned into part of somebody else's plumbing. I called the management office before I even walked back home. The property manager, a slick guy named Brandon Ellis, answered with the kind of fake confidence people use when they think they're talking to someone too polite to argue. He said the utility line had supposedly been there forever, claimed everything was perfectly legal, even tossed around the phrase grandfathered infrastructure like he expected that to magically end the conversation. The problem was, I'd owned every inch of that property long before Cedar Ridge existed. There wasn't anything old enough to be grandfathered. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office and started pulling public documents. That's when things went from shady to unbelievable. Their developer had actually submitted paperwork requesting an easement across my property almost 18 months earlier. The county denied it because the signature from the landowner, supposedly mine, didn't match any legal documents on file. Someone had forged my signature, failed to get approval anyway, then decided to bury the pipe and hope I never figured it out. I remember sitting there staring at those papers thinking this couldn't possibly be real, because nobody could be arrogant enough to build an entire luxury neighborhood around the assumption that one landowner would never ask questions. I called Brandon again and told him I'd found the rejected easement application. There was a long pause before his voice changed completely. Suddenly, he wasn't talking about grandfather clauses anymore. Now he wanted to be reasonable, maybe work out some kind of arrangement, maybe offer me a little money for the inconvenience. I laughed because inconvenience is when somebody parks in your driveway for an afternoon. Turning another man's creek into your sewage route is something else entirely. I told him they had 30 days to remove every illegal pipe crossing my property, or I'd start making phone calls they weren't going to enjoy. He actually chuckled before hanging up on me, like I was just another stubborn country guy bluffing his way through a conversation. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as an accident or even simple greed. They hadn't made a mistake. They had built their entire community around the belief that I'd never fight back. Now, let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this actually work. According to standard procedure, nobody, not a developer, not an HOA, not even a utility company gets to run permanent infrastructure across private property without a valid legal easement or the owner's written permission. From a legal perspective, forging a landowner's signature doesn't magically create rights. It usually creates a much bigger problem because what started as a property dispute can quickly become fraud, environmental violations, and in some cases even criminal investigations. This is a psychological trap developers sometimes fall into after selling expensive homes. They convince themselves that fixing the problem properly would cost too much. So they gamble that one ordinary property owner won't have the time, money, or determination to push back. Most people fold under that kind of pressure, but every once in a while they pick the wrong neighbor. The lesson here is simple. If someone builds their entire business plan around the assumption that you'll stay quiet, speaking up becomes the most expensive thing that can happen to them. The morning after Brandon laughed and hung up on me, I quit wondering whether they would do the right thing and started making sure they couldn't avoid doing it. I spent the next several days on the phone with every agency that had jurisdiction over water quality, wastewater systems, and environmental compliance, carefully documenting everything I'd found, every photograph I'd taken, every county record showing the rejected easement application, every sample of Cloudy Creek water I'd collected. Nobody sounded particularly excited on the phone, but nobody dismissed me either, and that's something I've learned over the years. Government investigators rarely raise their voices. They just keep asking for more documents until someone starts getting nervous. Less than a week later, White County trucks rolled into Cedar Ridge Preserve before most residents had finished breakfast. Inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards, cameras, survey equipment, and water testing kits. They marked locations with bright flags, collected samples from storm drains, walked the creek from end to end, and asked questions that Brandon clearly wasn't prepared to answer. From my property line, I watched him trying to smile, while sweat soaked through the collar of his expensive polo shirt. Every time another inspector pointed toward the woods where that hidden pipe crossed my land, his expression got a little tighter. Residents started gathering outside their homes, whispering to one another, wondering why environmental officials suddenly seemed more interested in their beautiful neighborhood than the artificial lake they'd been advertising in real estate brochures. A few homeowners even wandered over to ask me what was happening, and I simply told them the truth. I had discovered an unauthorized sewer line crossing my property, and the county was investigating. The surprise on their faces told me most of them had never been informed about any of it. That part bothered me more than I expected. Those families had spent serious money buying their dream homes, and they deserved better than being lied to by the people who built the place. A couple of days later, I met with an attorney who specialized in property rights and environmental disputes. I walked into his office expecting a long legal battle, but after reviewing the documents, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Cole," he said, "you don't have to help someone trespass forever." He explained that I couldn't intentionally create pollution or destroy someone else's infrastructure, but I absolutely had the right to protect my own property from continuing contamination using lawful measures on my own land. That conversation changed everything. Instead of thinking about revenge, I started thinking about boundaries. If my creek had become part of their illegal drainage route, then my first responsibility was restoring my own land. I hired a licensed excavation contractor, showed him the survey maps, explained exactly where the unauthorized crossing sat, and together we designed a compact earthen barrier positioned entirely on my side of the property. We weren't touching their pipe. We weren't damaging county property. We were simply redirecting surface water and protecting the creek from further contamination while the investigation continued. Every permit required for the earthwork was secured, every measurement documented, every step photographed. I wanted every decision to stand up to scrutiny, because I knew Brandon would accuse me of everything under the sun once his shortcut stopped working. The contractor finished the project in 2 days. It looked almost disappointingly ordinary, just a reinforced earthen berm surrounded by fresh soil and erosion control fabric. If you drove past it, you'd probably think someone was repairing storm damage. Nothing dramatic happened that first evening. Nothing happened the next morning either. Then Saturday arrived. The same weekend Cedar Ridge hosted its annual Summer on the Lake celebration. Music drifted across the valley all afternoon. Food trucks lined the entrance. Luxury SUVs filled every available parking space. I could hear laughter echoing through the trees while I worked on replacing fence posts near my barn. Around sunset, the music suddenly stopped. A few seconds later came that strange silence I'd never forgotten. Then people started yelling. I climbed onto the porch with my binoculars. Around 200 residents dressed in bright summer clothes stood frozen around the community pool. The decorative fountains had shut off. Air bubbles rolled to the surface where crystal-clear water had been only moments earlier. Within seconds, the water turned cloudy, then darker, and panic spread across the deck faster than wildfire through dry grass. Lifeguards blew whistles. Parents grabbed children. Someone slipped while trying to run. Employees shouted for everyone to clear the area. Emergency maintenance crews rushed in with portable pumps, but every attempt to lower the water only made the underlying problem more obvious. Their wastewater system had nowhere to send what it had been illegally pushing across my property. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I simply watched reality catch up with years of bad decisions. By Monday, the neighborhood looked completely different. Cleanup crews wearing protective equipment replaced pool attendants. Service trucks lined every street. Temporary sanitation equipment appeared near the clubhouse. Local news crews parked outside the entrance after residents started posting photos online. The story spread quickly because luxury communities aren't supposed to become environmental headlines overnight. Brandon finally called again, and this time the confidence was gone. "Cole," he said, his voice cracking with frustration, "you're destroying property values. People are furious. This has to stop." I leaned back in my chair and let him finish before answering. "Brandon, my creek was here long before your subdivision. I'm protecting my property from contamination. If your neighborhood depended on illegally using my land, that's not my decision to fix." He accused me of sabotage. I reminded him that the county had already confirmed the easement had been denied. He insisted there had to be a compromise. I told him there always had been one: build the wastewater treatment system the county originally required, instead of gambling on somebody else's land. The call ended with another long silence. Only this time, he was the one who hung up without another word. Over the next several weeks, the financial damage piled up faster than anyone expected. Emergency septic contractors charged premium rates. Environmental consultants were hired. Engineers redesigned the wastewater system. Insurance companies began asking uncomfortable questions about undisclosed infrastructure. Several homeowners organized meetings demanding answers from the HOA board, and once they learned about the forged easement application, the mood shifted from frustration to outrage. Those residents realized they hadn't just purchased expensive homes, they'd inherited someone else's legal nightmare. Lawsuits followed. Buyers claimed material facts had been concealed during sales. Contractors blamed developers. Developers blamed consultants. Consultants blamed management. Everybody suddenly discovered that accountability was a game best played by pointing fingers at someone else. Meanwhile, county investigators completed their reports. The findings were brutal. Unauthorized infrastructure, environmental violations, improper documentation, and ongoing discharge concerns triggered substantial penalties along with mandatory corrective action. Cedar Ridge had no choice but to begin constructing the treatment facilities they should have built from the beginning, a project that cost far more than simply doing the job correctly the first time. As excavation equipment tore through common areas and construction fences surrounded what had once been the neighborhood's showpiece landscaping, Brandon requested one final meeting. We met at a small diner outside town, where he looked 10 years older than the man who'd laughed at me over the phone. He slid a settlement proposal across the table. It included compensation for the unauthorized use of my property, full restoration of the creek, removal of every illegal section of pipe, replacement of damaged vegetation, long-term environmental monitoring, and payment of my legal expenses. The number at the bottom was more money than I'd paid for my cabin and acreage combined years earlier. I read every page carefully before looking up at him. "I'll sign," I said. "But the barrier stays exactly where it is until the last unauthorized connection is removed, the creek tests clean, and every promise in this agreement is completed." He didn't argue. He simply nodded because, for the first time since we'd met, he understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Owning expensive homes didn't give them the right to treat someone else's land like it existed for their convenience. Justice hadn't arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived one document, one inspection, and one lawful decision at a time. And in the end, the shortcut they thought would save them millions became the single most expensive mistake their development had ever made. A few months later, the construction crews were finally gone. The last section of a legal pipe had been removed from beneath my property, and the creek looked like the one I remembered before Cedar Ridge ever existed. The water ran clear enough to see smooth stones on the bottom again. Minnows slowly returned. The frogs came back after sunset, and one chilly morning I watched a doe and her fawn stop to drink from the same bend in the creek they'd avoided for nearly a year. That moment meant more to me than the settlement check ever could. Don't get me wrong, the money helped. It paid for restoring the land, replacing damaged trees, and making improvements around my cabin I'd been putting off for years. But what mattered most was knowing nobody would ever quietly decide that my property existed for their convenience again. Brandon eventually left the management company. The original developer spent years untangling lawsuits. And several homeowners later told me they wish someone had uncovered the truth before they ever signed closing papers. I never blamed those families because they were sold a dream built on shortcuts they never knew existed. From a legal perspective, the settlement wasn't really a victory over my neighbors. It was a reminder that property rights only mean something when ordinary people are willing to defend them. According to standard procedure, every easement, every utility crossing, and every environmental permit exists for a reason, because once somebody decides the rules are optional, the damage almost always spreads far beyond the person who made that decision. This is a psychological trap that shows up in more places than people realize. When organizations get large enough, it's easy for decision makers to convince themselves that one individual won't notice, won't understand, or won't fight back. They stop seeing people as owners and start seeing them as obstacles, and that's usually the moment they make the mistake that costs them everything. I still get asked whether I enjoyed watching their luxury pool shut down and their perfect neighborhood unravel. The honest answer is, not really. I didn't wake up hoping anyone would lose money or spend months dealing with construction crews. What I wanted was the same thing I'd wanted from the day I bought that land, a clean creek, a quiet home, and the simple respect every property owner deserves. Everything that happened afterward was the natural consequence of choices they had already made long before I discovered that hidden pipe. The lesson here is that justice doesn't always arrive with flashing lights or dramatic courtroom speeches. Sometimes it arrives one inspection at a time, one document at a time, one lawful decision at a time, until the truth becomes too expensive to ignore. If someone builds their success on cutting corners, eventually those corners disappear beneath their own feet. As for me, these days my mornings are peaceful again. I sit on the same front porch with a cup of coffee, listen to the creek instead of construction equipment, and every now and then I catch myself smiling when I remember that all they had to do from the beginning was ask permission or build the system they were legally required to build. It would have been cheaper, easier, and a whole lot less embarrassing. Instead, they chose arrogance over honesty, and they ended up paying for both. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a developer, or a neighbor who thought they could push you around because they assumed you'd stay quiet, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Drop it in the comments because chances are someone else has lived through something similar and could learn from your experience. And if you enjoyed this story and want more real-world property disputes, legal showdowns, and small-town justice where patience beats intimidation every single time, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.